Hey there, and welcome to today's episode of the podcast where we are talking all about how to maintain muscle in a calorie deficit. Now, you've worked hard. You've worked hard over the course of the last few weeks, months, maybe even years to build up some precious muscle. I know you guys out there are thinking, well, I've sculpted these perfect pecs, these t-shirt busting arms. So when I come to lose some body fat, I don't want to be ending up with a pigeon chest and some arms that look like anorexic twiglets. Vice versa, females out there, you are the same. You've been building muscle in those perfectly goddess-like glutes. And when it comes to now shedding a little bit of body fat so you can show that new physique off and maybe even have some abs on show, you don't now want to really descend into a, let's say, less peachy butt. You don't want to go down that route. You want to retain all of that muscle that you've built, all of that precious muscle you've been working hard to build. You want to keep it. So how do you do that? How do you maintain muscle while you're in a calorie deficit? Now, as I'm going to talk through this, it's actually not that difficult of a process to keep hold of your gains. It's a bit of a misconception that going into a calorie deficit, that reducing those calories down is going to automatically start to turn your body into this cannibalizing environment where it's going to eat away at your precious muscle that you've built up. Unless, of course, you do things super slow and take a year and a half to lose some body fat. Now, I'm going to walk you through what actually is the case and what actually you need to focus on and what actually you need to worry about, if anything at all. So as I said before, the popular belief is that there's a risk of losing all of your muscle, all of your gains, if you cut your calories. And especially so if you cut your calories too much. Now, this is a nightmare for most of you, a nightmare that doesn't even bear thinking about. So maybe you're super tentative now about how you manage your calories. You're super tentative about protein. You try and meticulously look at macro splits and all of this sort of stuff that's really kind of intricate level of detail. Actually, for the vast majority of you, macro splits just don't matter a jot. Naturally, your calories, you can probably be a bit more aggressive as long as you can adhere to it and it's not reckless on that point of view. You can probably not really worry about too much of these things because the reality is not so dramatic as you might have thought. Now, the only difference that I'm going to say up front is that this approach doesn't apply if you're already lean. So if you're already someone who has the abs popping, washboard stomach, veins are popping, you're already pretty lean, then I guess there is going to be a situation where you're probably not going to want to really diet too aggressively, and you really do want to do some specific things to make sure that you look after and you preserve the lean muscle that you've built already. But I'm guessing that the majority of you listening to this aren't already at that stage where you are lean, mean, at the kind of point where you're thinking about stepping on stage. Maybe you are. If that's the case, maybe this one just isn't for you. But if you're not already lean, then the whole issue about losing muscle is just much less of an issue. The key thing to maintaining muscle in a calorie deficit is your training. Yes, your training. If you are still resistance training to the same level as you were previously, the likelihood of you losing muscle is so greatly reduced. So don't be tempted to back off of the resistance training. You don't necessarily have to do it to the same intensity if you don't want to. You don't have to do the same amount of sessions per week if you don't want to. But they don't feel like you have to back off either. You don't have to go into this kind of super relaxed approach to your training where you're dialing in really, really light weights. You're barely even touching the weights, barely pushing yourself. You don't really have to do that. Once you've got that training in place, you're creating, again, like the stimulus for your body to keep that muscle. It wants to keep that muscle if it's being given that stimulus to train, to try and adapt. And you can really push your calories quite hard if you're still doing that resistance training. Now, you could probably go anywhere between 10 and 40% of a calorie deficit 40% is super aggressive and would probably only be for someone who doesn't have any hang-ups about food, very good relationship with food, very good levels of adherence, probably has done it before so they know what they're getting themselves into, and can really kind of stick to that super aggressive style of dieting. It's not really for people who are yo-yo dieters or have like issues with food or don't really aren't really able to sustain weight and fat loss. That's not really for you. Now, I've done a podcast on rapid fat loss where I go into that in more detail, so you can really delve into it there. But when training stops, then that sort of aggressive calorie deficit, you don't really want to push into that. You want to keep that training stimulus there, and you want to keep also your protein intake high. So if you've got this sort of scenario where, let's say, for example, you got injured. If you got injured and for some reason your protein intake wasn't that great right now, then you're not going to want to push your calorie deficit too far, because then you are going to drift into a point where you are going to lose some muscle, potentially. So question whether that 40% deficit is the right approach for you from an adherence point of view. So that's the first thing. So yes, you can push your calories hard as long as you are, keeping that resistance training going and keeping your protein intake high. You can push calories harder than you think, but always underline it with adherence. If you can't adhere to a more aggressive calorie deficit, it is a pointless calorie deficit. The right calorie deficit for you is the one that you can stick to for the longer period of time. If that means that you go 10% for a slightly longer period of time, but you can make consistent progress each and every week, that's way better than this kind of boom or bust type of approach, saying, well, I'm going to go 40% for like 3 days, then I'm going to get so fucking hungry that I'm just going to have a blowout, and then I'm going to say, well, I'm eating in a 40% calorie deficit. Well, no, you're not, because you probably just had 10,000 calories in your blowout. But anyway, that's aside. That's for another podcast. Now, regardless of what calorie deficit you use, you're probably going to lose some muscle. Now, that's going to be a bit of a shock to everybody that, oh my God, I don't want to lose any muscle. But the actual amount of muscle you're going to lose is probably not even something you're going to be able to notice. Whether you decide to do your calorie deficit quite hard and therefore your weight loss quite fast, or whether you try to do it quite slowly, the actual amount of muscle loss is probably going to be about the same. Again, under the umbrella that you are keeping resistance training going and you are keeping protein intake high. If you do those sorts of things, then really the amount of muscle you're going to lose is probably just so small, it's not even worth worrying about. There's other things you might want to focus on, like making sure your sleep is good and making sure that you've got some of those basic things in place just so that you can create this optimum environment. But the reality is that you will look less muscly when you go through a calorie deficit phase, mainly because you are depleting your body of glycogen in the main. So your muscles will be sapped of their glycogen, so those glycogen stores will start to deplete. They have, for every gram of glycogen that's stored in your muscle cells, there's 3 grams of water. So imagine all of that coming out of your body as part of this process. It's perfectly natural, nothing to worry about. So you're just going to look a little bit flatter. You're going to feel a little bit skinnier because you haven't got that sort of volume in the muscles. So that you have that natural look and you have that natural feel of feeling a little bit weaker, feeling a little bit depleted. And that's going to translate to, well, actually, I don't look as big. I don't feel as big as I used to. And that's just part of the process. You don't. But when you come down to the process of maybe introducing a few more carbohydrates, maybe through part of a diet break or after your dieting period is finished, quite quickly that volume starts to come back. And it doesn't necessarily have to come back in the form of excess body fat on top of that as well, as long as you manage your calories correctly. Now, the other reason why you might feel like you've lost muscle when actually you haven't is that you just weren't that muscly in the first place. Now, that's quite harsh to say, but it's true that it's very, very eye-opening for a lot of people to realize that when you actually lose body fat, the realization that actually having that body fat made you look a lot bigger than you actually were is a real thing. So when you strip your body back to like very, very low levels of body fat, you realize that actually the muscle underneath is not as big as you thought it was. So have you lost muscle? No, not really. Maybe your muscles just weren't as big as you thought they were, and also you've got this depletion effect. So that's kind of those two variables happening together that are really kind of causing you to feel that way. The actual amount of muscle loss that you've had, if you've kind of made those basic things a constant throughout the process, so you've kept resistance training in place, you've kept protein intake high, you focus on sleep and some of those basics, it's really not going to be that much of muscle loss. It's not that huge a thing to worry about. And you're certainly not going to find the answer in perfect levels of macro splits and all of that sort of stuff. So, having said all of that, what are then the key things, the key rules, guidelines, whatever you want to call it, for maintaining muscle in a calorie deficit? So first thing first, train. Do not go into a sort of method of training that makes you a bit of a pussy. So you don't want to still train hard. Okay, if you want to back off your intensity a little bit, cool, that's up to you. Personally, I don't really change my training that much when I go into a calorie deficit. I just don't feel the need. If I'm due to have a form of deload week or rest week, I will take that deload week and I will take that rest week. If I'm not, then I will just carry on and plow on with my training as it was. Yes, you'll be a little bit of a strength loss somewhere in that calorie deficit process, but that's again to be expected. It's something normal. Make sure you keep your protein intake high, 1.8 to 2.7 grams per kilo, somewhere in that range. Obviously, most people probably just going to opt for 2 grams per kilo because it's fucking easy to calculate. Now, if you're slightly overweight, then you've got, I would say, a little bit more leeway. So the more overweight you are, then you can probably afford to have a little bit lower protein intake, mainly because, you know, if you're carrying around a lot of body fat, it can really artificially inflate the amount of protein that you really need. So don't feel like that you have to stick to that. If you are a little bit more overweight, feel like you can dial it back a little bit. Carbs and fat are literally still in that realm of do whatever the fuck you want, whatever you prefer and whatever helps you to adhere to your calorie deficit, then do that. If you are the guy or girl that wants to do full-on keto, go for it. If you are someone who likes bread, pasta, rice, cool, go for that. Do not feel like you are hampering your progress, hampering your fat loss progress by opting to have those things in or out of your diet. That is up to you. Now, calories, as I mentioned before, ballpark that 10 to 40%. It's a huge window. And again, you can kind of ebb and flow that. Again, if you're not down to a specific date you have to lose weight by. So let's say, for example, you're not trying to get stage lean by the next 90 days, or you're not trying to diet down for a wedding in the next 8 to 10 weeks, then you have a much more relaxed approach to this. You know, you could, for example, have a few weeks at a 10% deficit just to ease yourself into the process. You could start quite aggressive and then dial it back if you wanted to. You could kind of flex it up and down depending on what social situations you've got. So for example, if you've got 8 weeks running up to a holiday, you might be quite aggressive with it. When you're on your holiday period, you might take a period of maintenance or just a slightly less of a calorie deficit. You can flex it as much as you want. When it comes to supplements, when you're in a deficit, again, there's not really that many, and especially not that many where you would think, okay, well, I'm going to take these for the specific process of maintaining muscle. I mean, I would always say take creatine, caffeine, and probably some beta-alanine, if you're looking to enhance performance in the gym, which therefore potentially helps you to even build muscle in a deficit, certainly helps you to perform well and maintain strength and things like that, which also could have a beneficial effect on preserving lean muscle. So they're from a more of a performance side of things, less so in like a specific, oh, if I take these, then I'm going to preserve muscle type of thing. It's just kind of like, if it helps you perform in the gym, cool, why not? And then also like your fish oils, your vitamin D, again, probably just essential just in general, not for this particular process, but they were the things that I would kind of stick to. So in summary, how to maintain muscle in a calorie deficit is not as complicated as you might think it is. Let's face it, you are going to be depleted on glycogen. You're going to be depleted in terms of calories. So you're going to look a little bit smaller anyway. Plus, the realization is that a drop in body fat will actually mean that you realize you probably weren't as muscly as you thought you were in the first place. So bear that in mind. But there are some basics that you want to stick to. So that's keep your training in there. So resistance training, keep your protein intake high, calorie deficit 10 to 40% of that, as long as you're training, as long as you're keeping that protein intake high. And then supplements, probably not many that are that specific, but keep those ones in that help you in terms of a performance side of things. And therefore, if you do all of that, you'll be doing all of you can. Plus, don't forget your sleep. You'll be doing all of the things that you can control, all the things within your power to make sure that you preserve as much muscle as possible when you go into that calorie deficit. So I hope this episode of the podcast really helped you give some clarity on what happens in a calorie deficit and also how to protect those gains that you've worked so hard for. If you did, follow me on Instagram. Come and let me know what you thought of this show. It's at iron_paradise_fitness. And I'll also drop a link in the show notes so that you can go to ironparadisefitness.com, check out more fat loss articles if you're into reading. I know that is sort of a rarity these days, but you do like looking at things with your eyes, then you can go and read some fat loss articles over on ironparadisefitness.com. And while you're out there, you can also download a whole bunch of free resources in my Lean Life Kickstarter plan that's going to give you a 4-week training program, guide on how to calculate your calories, and so much more. So head over to ironparadisefitness.com and go and grab that. But for now, all I'm going to say is keep living the lean life, and I'll see you for the next episode of the show.